Welcome to the sixth talk on the history of Germany between 1815 and 2015. We're now going to focus on the GDR or East Germany, especially after the period of the building of the Berlin Wall, effectively the 1960s through to the late 80s. We're going to look at it in terms of theme. We're going to start with politics. The first part we can say is in the 60s, a new constitution was drawn up. This was an avowedly socialist document which declared the GDR a socialist state and acknowledged the leading role of the SED. The previous one had some continuity with the old Weimar constitution. This was effectively replaced. And in 1971, the old-time leader who had been there since 1950, Walter Ulbricht, was replaced by Erich Honecker, who was seen as a new broom. There were hopes for a more liberal regime, but Honecker was unwilling to give up the SED's monopoly on power, and politics stagnated under his rule. Ulbricht was seen as too much of an old-style Stalinist, and basically the USSR wanted a change, and so instigated the change, despite having a belief, or at least tacit belief, that said that they would not interfere in the lives and affairs of states within the Warsaw Pact. Leonid Brezhnev wanted Honecker to replace Ulbricht. However, as I said before, this became more and more a case of replacing like with like. In terms of the economy in the 1960s, this was certainly initially good news. The new economic system of 1963, there was more freedom for producers and consumers, and therefore better living standards. There was improved growth in this period, and the GDR became the strongest economy in the Eastern Bloc. People came from, politicians, etc., came from all over, including the Soviet Union, to buy East German products. By the 1980s, however, there was economic stagnation and financial crisis. Having said that, though, there were still pockets of progress, especially in electronics and to some extent, bizarrely, computers. In terms of society, there obviously was an avowed belief in socialism and equality. There was a greater economic equality, especially in terms of subsidised housing and foodstuffs. Less emphasis on material prosperity, more on human values. There was full employment and specific policies designed for women. All legislation that could be a barrier to women's emancipation was repealed, and women's equality was a major aim of the socialist state. Included things like provision of role models in literature, newspaper, state support for childcare, the right to decide whether to bear children or not. Abortion was free and legal up to 12 weeks from 1972. There was state provision for creches for young children. There's a comparison there in terms of public creches. The GDR and the FRG, huge, great big difference, especially in creches and after-school care. Facilities were free and state-run and widely available even at unsocial hours to suit factory workers on shifts. Also, by 1989, there was a pay equivalent of 1 year to sickness benefit for the first child, 18 months ditto for second and subsequent children, up to 3 years if no creche place available for the child. Single mothers especially supported by the state. Married women would give, especially over 40, had 1 day off per month to do all the housework, and home loans for young married couples waived with the birth of a child. However, there were problems with all this, and the main thing was this was a state-determined equality rather than women deciding for themselves what they wanted. Women had to expect to conform to male working patterns, with the state taking the female role. Women's responsibility for the domestic sphere was reinforced rather than challenged by this legislation. In other words, women continued doing the household chores as well as having to go out to work. Measures all directed at women as mothers, childless women still viewed as abnormal. Long maternity leaves meant that employing women in responsible roles could be disruptive, and there was, as I said before, a double burden on working mothers and wives. In terms of the churches, they were beginning to have a much more substantial role, especially after 1978. If you remember what I said in the talk about Ostpolitik, uh, in 1975 there were the Helsinki Accords, and there were the GDR was a signatory to this, basically saying that there should be greater human rights, and they were held to this, and they made agreements with the churches in 1978. The churches played a significant role in health and education, running hospitals and old people's homes, and could also be a useful role in working with groups such as alcoholics and homosexuals who were denounced by the state. Having said that, the churches started becoming a channel for opposition during the 1980s. As a result of this, the Stasi, the state security services, became more and more powerful, especially in the 80s, as it says there, with more than 80,000 official employees, plus between 110 and 180 informers, or IMs, roughly 1 per 60 citizens, including children, were being informed on. The Stasi infiltrated each and every dissident group. Especially vicious techniques of destroying private lives were used. Ongoing discussion if IM knew or could have known that they served the Stasi. Some probably just thought they were handing information over to their boss about somebody who was not working well or had suspicions. They, to some extent, possibly did not know that they were working for the Stasi. At least one proven case in IM marrying and then spying on his own wife. So here are some ways of analysing or interpreting the state known as the GDR. Could it be seen, for example, as a modernising dictatorship? Obviously, when we think of dictatorship, we see that as a negative, but to some extent, a modernising dictatorship could be seen partly as a positive. This could be seen as in terms of the complex industrial economy that was required for it to exist, especially in the 70s and 80s, meant that it was not necessarily an ideological elite, but more of a rational elite. In other words, thinkers, technicians, engineers being at the top end. With the new economic reforms, there was an attempt to decentralise and incentivise the economy. There was a technological revolution, as I mentioned before, especially in the 1980s, the gamble on the microtechnology. There was also a welfare dictatorship, as identified by the historian Konrad Jarausch. There was indirect use of social power to predispose groups to choose socialism. Full employment hospitals, education systems created fond memories. People, in a sense, felt that they were losing something to some degree when reunification occurred in 1990. And there was an educational dictatorship. The party, in a sense, was in loco parentis, knowing what was good for the people. What claims did the state make? Well, the communists declared that they wanted to produce a new man, that in some ways they could change humanity away from wanting individual freedoms and wants and essentially selfish, but into something much more communalistic. There's a high degree of voluntary membership in mass organisations. People weren't forced to do this. There was a great emphasis on things like marches and rallies. Propaganda, well, notwithstanding, mass of people had a realistic view of the East and West. People knew what the situation was. Another way to look at it was in terms of the niche society. This was, first of all, mentioned by Gauss, who was a West German official who had been to East Germany and saw that people lived relatively normal private lives, which were possible behind public conformity. Difficult to assess this, because how do you determine what a normal private life is? In essence, because it is private. Okay. How far did people opt in and opt out within these two different spheres? How far did persecution play a role? These are sort of ways of discussing this idea of a niche society. How far it's useful? Well, it is a useful way of analysing, but again, as I mentioned, difficult to judge as there is very little detail on this. And finally, another way is looking at collective biographies. This is, in a sense, by looking at the way people remembered the the East. And one of the things that has been seen since the 1990s is what's known as nostalgia. People who were born into socialism feel that they lost something, and to some extent they had, because virtually everything disappeared. This was not a reunification. This was a takeover by the FRG. Everything was replaced in the GDR. Very, very few things remained, and so people felt that this was not a joining together, but a defeat, that they were ideologically defeated, and so wanted to go back to something that they felt more comfortable with. The other way of looking at it, of course, is it was just a marketing exercise. Let's sell these people things like the gherkins, the Spreewald gherkins, which people in the East used to eat a great deal of, that type of thing. So was the GDR morally superior to the West? It was certainly less materialistic, less likely to judge someone by what they owned. Firms were committed to social role rather than profits, supportive social networks. There was no pornography or as such, or homelessness or unemployment, officially that is, although there were elements of this. Little crime, prostitution or drug addiction. However, there was a surveillance society with information there about that. Again, there is a great deal of the two sides of the coin. There's a lot of what was said that didn't exist, but officially that did exist. Especially in the 1980s, where there was increased drug addiction, increased prostitution and increased crime. What were the achievements? Well, the first GDR cosmonaut in 1976, beating the FRG into space. The GDR polyclinics were one of the few legacies adopted by the United Germany. East Germany's honour system, the state was adept at rewarding participation with a mania for badges, as you can see there, and sporting success, especially people like Katharina Witt, who've gone on to do a variety of different things outside of sports, and to some extent have become celebrities beyond the GDR.